Now let's talk a little bit about what we see this season. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about this season and the last season, and give you some data that we're seeing to help you kind of understand where things are now. One of the trends that was certainly happening before the COVID period and just continues to happen, and what we're seeing is more and more schools kind of jumping on this bandwagon, is filling their class with early decision or restricted early action. We'll talk about the difference in those a little bit later. But you see a school like Tulane, which 2 years ago did not even have an early decision option for students. So that wasn't even a possibility. They're filling 57% of their class early decision. So what do you think happens at Tulane when you apply a regular? Well, at that point, they filled up a huge chunk of their class. Now they're looking for those kids that they want to add to fill the class out. So it becomes much more selective at regular decision. So this data is really important. Now there's certain schools like a Tufts, which still hasn't really gone up quite so high. University of Virginia is another one that just added ED last year. And so they're at 30%, tweaking up slightly from the year before. So when you're thinking about colleges and where you might ultimately apply, this number is important because it tells you a little bit about the story of the selectivity that's going to happen in regular decision. A few just kind of stats just to kind of frame things. 96% of the admitted students at Brown were in the top 10% of their class. And I think top 10%, top 8% tends to be about what one would think of in highly selective admissions. Penn and Duke reject 3 out of 5 valedictorians. So that's the #1 student, okay? 27% of accepted students at Dartmouth are expected to be the valedictorian or the salutatorian. And then you can see like at U Chicago, the average test score 15, 18, 34 on the ACT, which again are about, where a student wants to be at in terms of test scores, if they're going to be applying to highly selective colleges. So this starts to frame for you a little bit what the colleges are looking for. Now let's talk a little bit about what's shifted. I'm sure many of you are aware that we've got the test optional world. Many of the schools were test optional, and we'll talk about that. But I'll tell you what we've really seen is transcripts have become even more important. Colleges have always been digging into your transcript, but I think we are seeing, for probably 2 reasons, really. One is test optional. So you've got that piece. The other is the kids have not had as many opportunities for engagement because of COVID. So that transcript, I always used to say, and I still say to students, the transcript's like the big enchilada, it's the thing in the middle that you can't run from. What are they looking at in transcript, which we'll talk about, is obviously your grades and the rigor of your coursework. Test scores are, and the test optional, has typically been sort of a validator of academic strength, right? And so I would say, and we'll talk further, that test scores have remained important is what we see. There are some places that are genuinely test optional. We definitely see some kids getting in. I don't have examples of students getting in test optional at the most selective schools in the last 2 years. So I do think test scores are still important. However, I don't think they're as important as they were before. So that means that transcript, which is your grades and your coursework, which means it really does matter that you're taking the most rigorous courses. And although I know students a lot of times tell me, well, it's a B, but it's really an A because I got the extra points. It really needs to be an A in the most rigorous coursework. And then the depth of engagement that a student has, because you get all these students applying and they look really similar oftentimes in their transcripts and their test scores. So it is their engagement that is oftentimes that thing that is separating out the groups, if you will. So that piece is really important. And that's something at a state or a national level, not like, you know, doing a summer program in the 10th grade that you pay to do is a great thing to explore interest and involvement. But for students who are aiming at top schools, it really is important that you're not just doing, you know, paid programs that are not, you know, somewhat competitive to get in. And then also common good activities, things that are impacting, showing character. Colleges do right now really, really, really care about character. So I'll say a little bit more about test optional. I think I pretty much said this. Is we're going to see, I think, in the highly selective schools, I think we're going to mostly see test optional stay in place. We've had a few places like Georgetown, which has always loved test scores. They have kept that. But I think we'll see test optional remain in a lot of the selective schools. I think as we go through all the colleges in the country, we're seeing the East Coast and the West Coast sort of holding on to test optional, and we're seeing the middle of the country, especially the South, adding test scores back in. But in the highly selective schools, I think we will, for the most part, see test optional remain. What I do want to say about this is I think students got super excited. And one of the reasons I think we saw such an enormous increase in the last cycle, we're not seeing quite the same level of increases. So we're seeing it kind of hold steady or go down ever so slightly, only because it went up so much in the number of applications last year. But I think we will see it remain, but I think you really want to aim to have a test score that is worthy of a highly selective school, and that should be an important part of your strategy. Now, this is always super interesting to me. What is the trait of a student who may want to consider highly selective schools? Because having done this a long time, I do see certain traits. Self-driven is the number one trait I see, and I see it year after year. I think obviously all of us, I'm a parent, I have 2 children. I think they're the greatest people in the world. And so sometimes as parents, we have a vision for our students that we want to see play out because we know how great they are. But what I know about the students, and I've had the joy of working with many students who've gone to highly selective schools, is that those students are driving their process. I just met with two today who probably will land in highly selective. They told me what they needed. They told me where, they're driving it. They love having a guide on the side. They're choosing activities because they're actually intellectually curious. So yes, I want to do an independent study on this because that would be so interesting and cool. Like, they have that internal drive that cannot be created. And so I think this is a really important thing to think about when you're thinking about your college list. Students, do I have that drive? And parents, is it my drive or their drive? I think is super, super important. They have to be competitive. They've got to be comfortable being in a competitive process. This is a competitive process. And some students will say to me, I just don't really want to do that, which is totally understandable.